The dust of southern France swirled in the afternoon heat as the convoy of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich rumbled forward, half-tracks growling, motorcyclists weaving between columns, officers leaning from staff cars with maps unfurled. For the reinforcements rushing toward Normandy, the mission seemed clear and the timeline certain. German command had told them confidently, 3 days. 3 days to reach the front. 3 days to throw the Allies back into the sea. 3 days to save France. Untersturmführer Otto Voss repeated that calculation in his mind as he clung to the side of his SD Kfz half-track. 3 days. He had memorized the roads, the fuel points, the rest stops. His column had rehearsed this kind of rapid deployment a dozen times before. They believed they would arrive like a hammer blow, a steel fist punching through the fragile Allied beachhead. The men joked about racing to Bayeux, about drinking Norman cider by nightfall, about showing the amateur Americans what a real armored division could do. But as the sun dropped behind the low hills, a sound reached them that turned those confident jokes to ice. A distant hum, thin at first, then swelling into a roar. Engines. Many engines. The kind that did not belong to German machines. Air alarm! Fighters! The first bombs fell with a thunderclap that lifted Voss off his feet and slammed him into the dirt. The half-track that had been beside him moments earlier exploded in a sphere of flame. Men, steel, and ammunition thrown skyward like shrapnel from a ruptured world. The road vanished under smoke. Trucks burned. Horses screamed. Radio operators shouted for Luftwaffe support that would never come. Above the chaos, black silhouettes slashed across the sky. Thunderbolts and typhoons diving with brutal precision, their rockets streaking into columns that had nowhere to hide. The fighters came again and again, as if the entire Allied air armada had descended for the sole purpose of murdering movement itself. And in that violent instant, Otto Voss understood something the German High Command had refused to admit. This was not a 3-day march. This was a slow death. Das Reich would never reach Normandy as a fighting formation. It would not punch through the beachhead. It would not rescue the collapsing German flank. Instead, the division would dissolve into a crawling, terrified procession, ambushed by partisans, harassed by resistant sabotage, and above all, annihilated from the air until its vehicles smoldered across hundreds of kilometers of French roads. By the time remnants of Das Reich staggered toward the front 17 days later, they had lost nearly a third of their vehicles, hundreds destroyed or abandoned, many never having seen a single Allied soldier. The shock of this disaster reverberated far beyond the division. To Allied generals watching the Normandy crisis unfold, the truth became impossible to avoid. Allied air supremacy was not a support factor, it was the central axis of modern warfare. The skies did not merely influence the battlefield, they dictated it. Movement, the lifeblood of mechanized operations, had become a privilege granted only at the mercy of the Allied air forces. The tragedy was not simply that Das Reich had been stopped. It was that Germany had never imagined an army could be paralyzed. For decades, German doctrine had placed mobility at the heart of war. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, initiative, and rapid concentration of force. But in Normandy, the Luftwaffe's collapse meant the Wehrmacht no longer controlled its own tempo. Every road was deadly. Every column was exposed. Every radio message might be heard by Allied spotters. Every movement became a gamble against a sky filled with fighters that Germany could neither deter nor evade. Even more devastating was the psychological effect. The soldiers of Das Reich, once among the most feared formations in Europe, found themselves crawling through forests, hiding under trees, traveling by night, abandoning vehicles in ditches, and praying that Allied aircraft were busy elsewhere. Men who once believed themselves unstoppable now recoiled at the mere growl of engines overhead. The motorized divisions of the Wehrmacht had entered the war believing they could carve lightning paths across continents. But in the summer of 1944, they learned that lightning now belonged to someone else. This script tells the story of that collapse, how a division that believed it could reach Normandy in 3 days instead spent 17 under siege from the air. It documents the destruction of movement, the disintegration of morale, and the birth of a new truth in modern warfare. Commanders do not control armies. Air superiority does. The fate of Das Reich became the fate of Germany itself. An army trapped not by enemy tanks, but by the unseen, ever-present threat of Allied aircraft that turned every road into a graveyard. The men of Das Reich had departed Montauban with a sense of purpose that bordered on arrogance. For 4 years, they had been the embodiment of German operational mobility, racing across the Balkans, cutting through the Soviet Union, crushing pockets of resistance with terrifying efficiency. Speed was their inheritance, maneuver was their identity. And even as the Normandy landings shocked the German command structure, Das Reich believed that one thing remained constant. When the Reich called, they would move, and the enemy would tremble at their arrival. Their maps told them the truth they wanted to believe. From southern France to the landing zones was a journey measured in days, not weeks. Their vehicles were fueled, their divisions rested, and their commanders convinced themselves that they were about to reenact the sweeping marches of 1940 and 1941. German officers told their men that delays were unimaginable. The division had 72 hours to reach the crisis point in Normandy, 72 hours to restore the front, 72 hours to prove once again that German mechanized warfare was unmatched. But the France of 1944 was not the France of 1940. The roads were no longer corridors of opportunity, they were kill zones. And as Das Reich soon discovered, the skies above those roads were no longer empty. Before the division had even traveled 20 kilometers, the first signs of the new reality emerged. A single reconnaissance plane appeared overhead, small, unarmed, seemingly insignificant. But the column halted. Officers shouted for camouflage. Men dove into ditches and hedgerows. Engines cut instantly, as if a single passing aircraft were a harbinger of doom. Because it was. The Allies had filled the sky with eyes. A reconnaissance aircraft's appearance was not a curiosity. It was a death sentence delivered on a delay. The Germans knew exactly what came next. Fighters, bombers, rockets, machine gun runs, dozens of aircraft converging on the road like vultures, sensing a dying animal. What the Germans did not understand, what they could not understand until too late, was that Allied air superiority had advanced far beyond their expectations. It wasn't merely superiority, it was saturation, domination, omnipresence. Allied air power did not scour the roads for German vehicles. It waited for them. Every river crossing, every intersection, every suspected convoy point was already under observation by aircraft that rotated in unbroken shifts. The Allies had turned the French transportation network into a trap. And Das Reich, still clinging to outdated assumptions about mobility, marched directly into it. The first attacks were brutal but expected. Fighter bombers dove onto the columns with terrifying precision, their rockets ripping through trucks as if designed solely to annihilate mechanized movement. But shock gave way to dread as the patterns emerged. Whenever the division tried to break camp, the planes arrived. Whenever they regrouped, the planes arrived. Whenever they attempted to bypass a blocked road, the planes arrived. Men began to joke, bitterly, that Allied pilots were hiding in the clouds, waiting for the Germans to turn the ignition keys. It was not a joke. Allied intelligence had fragmented Germany's operational maps long before Das Reich began its march. Ultra-intercepts, French resistance reports, and reconnaissance aircraft formed a perfect net, one that caught every German movement hours, sometimes days, before it even reached the next village. The Germans moved cautiously at first, then fearfully, then desperately. The wide, smooth roads that had once carried blitzkrieg across Europe became impossible to use. Daylight movement became suicidal. Every kilometer demanded reconnaissance. Every bend in the road might conceal a wrecked convoy. Vehicles burned to the axles, their crews scattered or buried. A journey that should have taken 3 days began to stretch and fracture. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but fear seeped through every command. One afternoon, a flight of typhoons dove on a marching column and reduced it to twisted metal in 30 seconds. Survivors lay stunned, deafened, spattered with oil and dirt. They had not fired a shot. They had not seen the enemy. They had simply been present. It became clear that Das Reich's march was no longer a mission. It was a gauntlet. The division tried moving at night, believing darkness would shield them. It didn't. The Allies used flares, searchlights from roving night fighters, and even moonlight to track them. Villages that offered cover by day became traps by night, full of narrow alleys and blind corners. Impossible for large vehicles to navigate without creating congestion. Congestion meant targets. Targets meant death, and everywhere the division turned, the French resistance sharpened the blade. Bridges were blown, trees felled, road signs altered, telephone lines cut. Small acts of sabotage multiplied into delays measured in hours. Hours became days, days became a catastrophe. What had once been a division built for speed now resembled a blind animal feeling its way through a forest filled with predators. There was no tempo, no initiative, no operational freedom, only survival. The psychological toll was immense. The soldiers of Das Reich, once confident and feared, found themselves crawling along hedge lines like prey. Men slept in ditches, terrified that the sound of an aircraft engine would be the last thing they ever heard. Officers stopped speaking of Normandy. They spoke instead of endurance, of hiding, of luck. They tried to maintain discipline, but fear was an acid that dissolved every expectation of German dominance. The division's identity, its pride in mobility, was shredded by a sky that punished any attempt to move. Each roadside crater and burned-out vehicle was not merely a tactical setback, but a psychological wound. The division had always believed the battlefield belonged to those who moved fastest. Now they understood the new rule. The battlefield belonged to whoever controlled the air. By the 17th day, Das Reich had not achieved its 72-hour objective. It had not even reached the halfway point without bleeding vehicles at every step. Nearly 30% of its motorized strength was gone, bombed, burned, abandoned, sabotaged, or simply immobilized by lack of fuel and constant harassment. The division arrived in Normandy not as a fresh armored formation, but as a crippled remnant of its former self. And when German High Command asked why they were late, the officers of Das Reich said only one thing: we no longer own movement. The 3-day march had become a 17-day nightmare, and the lesson it delivered reshaped the entire German understanding of the war. Air power had become the architect of all movement, and without the sky, the road no longer belonged to Germany. For the officers of Das Reich, the march to Normandy became something more than a delayed reinforcement. It became a revelation, a slow, crushing awakening to the fact that the war they thought they were fighting no longer existed. In their minds, the road north was supposed to be a corridor of maneuver, a predictable axis of advance that armored divisions had exploited for years. But now, the corridor had changed shape. It had gained a ceiling, a hostile one, and the sky, ever present, ever watching, ever punishing, was no longer empty space, but a weapon wielded with terrifying efficiency. The divide between German expectation and Allied reality revealed itself in the most mundane details. Men who had once laughed during route planning now flinched at the thought of moving a kilometer in daylight. Officers who had studied the Darien now crouched over maps with shaking hands, trying to chart paths not of maximum efficiency, but of minimal visibility. The question was no longer how fast can we reach Normandy, but when will the next attack come? Because the Germans slowly discovered the truth. It didn't matter where they were on the map. What mattered was that the Allies were overhead. From the moment Das Reich left Montauban, the air threat did not follow them, it controlled them. Allied reconnaissance planes circled endlessly, invisible harbingers of destruction. Typhoons and thunderbolts dived suddenly, howling as they released rockets that tore through armor as though cleaving paper. Even the sound of aircraft engines began to induce panic. A low growl in the distance could stop an entire battalion dead. Men dropping tools, jumping from vehicles, scattering into trees, abandoning any semblance of formation just to avoid being caught on a road. Speed, once the lifeblood of German warfare, became the one thing they feared most. The roads of rural France turned into open-air execution grounds. Wide highways became death traps. Open fields were invitations to annihilation. German drivers sought out narrow farm lanes, forest paths, drainage ditches, any space where a canopy or hedge might conceal them for a few minutes longer. But these detours brought their own torment. Vehicles bogged in mud, engines overheated, tires shredded. Columns tangled themselves in impossible choke points, and every delay increased the chance that the next Allied patrol would find them. Allied pilots, emboldened by total air dominance, hunted German vehicles like predators stalking wounded prey. They did not fight battles, they executed. They flew in pairs or small groups, diving on targets with meticulous, almost clinical precision. In some attacks, they strafed from such low altitude that German survivors later wrote about seeing the pilots' goggles, the curve of their helmets, even the flash of a grin as they pulled out of a rocket run. But the terror from the sky was only half the nightmare. On the ground, the French resistance turned every road into a labyrinth of harassment and delay. Saboteurs disrupted rail lines, ambushed convoys, and destroyed bridges just hours before German units reached them. Road signs were rotated or swapped, sending convoys into dead ends. Telephone lines were severed, isolating units and forcing them to halt until couriers could restore communication. Even a single fallen tree, cut deliberately by villagers with axes, could trap an entire column long enough for Allied aircraft to arrive and finish the job. The Germans tried everything to regain momentum. Camouflage nets, smoke screens, decoys, staggered departures, night marches, silent intervals with engines off. None of it mattered. The Allies dictated the rhythm of movement, not the Germans. One battalion attempted to move under cover of early dawn mist, only for the fog to lift abruptly and expose them to a full squadron of fighter bombers that shattered the column in minutes. Another battalion hid in forested groves, believing themselves concealed, until rockets ripped through the trees and sent shards of oak and metal slicing through flesh. Again and again, the reports sent back to German headquarters carried the same message. We cannot move. Not we are delayed. Not we are taking fire. But the deeper, more existential cry of an army discovering that its foundational doctrine had evaporated. Movement, the thing that had defined the Wehrmacht's early war success, was no longer an asset. It was a liability. The psychological weight of this paralysis grew unbearable. German soldiers wrote home describing the march as a punishment, a corridor of death, a slow execution. Men whispered that the sky itself hated them. Officers found themselves unable to rally their troops with talk of honor or duty. The threat from above was too overwhelming, too unpredictable, too absolute. One sergeant later said that the Allied aircraft felt like gods descending to smite us, a sentiment that would have been inconceivable just 2 years earlier. It was not simply that the Luftwaffe had failed, it was that it had vanished. German soldiers looked up at the vast blue sky and realized that it no longer contained their comrades. No fighter escorts, no protective patrols, no counterattacks. They were alone under a ceiling owned entirely by the enemy. By the 8th day, Das Reich had lost so many vehicles that its march no longer resembled mechanized movement at all. Men walked beside crippled trucks, carrying ammunition and supplies by hand. Horses, ironically, became essential to hauling equipment that trucks could no longer transport safely. The proud armored division had regressed into a patched-together hybrid of tanks, carts, motorcycles, and long lines of exhausted infantry. By the 12th day, morale had fractured. Officers stopped promising that Normandy was close. The division no longer marched with the anticipation of battle, but with the dread of being spotted, of hearing the engines, of watching the road erupt beneath them again. Every village leveled by airstrikes, every burned-out chassis still smoking by the roadside, became a grim reminder that they were engaged in a hopeless effort. The division was no longer a combat force in transit. It was a column in retreat, except moving forward. And by the 17th day, when the remnants of Das Reich finally reached the outskirts of Normandy, they arrived not like the hammer blow German command had promised, but like a ghost of their former power. Their tanks were depleted, their trucks destroyed, their men shaken, their identity shattered. The division that once epitomized German operational speed had been reduced to a case study in paralysis. And the lesson was devastatingly clear. The battlefield now belonged to whoever ruled the sky. The road was no longer Germany's domain. Movement itself had become a permission the Allies could grant or refuse. By the summer of 1944, Das Reich was not merely confronting Allied aircraft, it was confronting an entirely new logic of warfare, one Germany had never prepared for, never conceived, and never adapted to. The Luftwaffe's collapse had not simply removed a protective layer, it had erased an entire dimension of German operational thinking. The division was discovering, kilometer by agonizing kilometer, that the Allies had fused air power, intelligence, and technology into a system that weaponized geography itself. France, lush, open, traversed by thousands of roads, had become a battlefield where every straight path, every open field, every village square served the needs of Allied fighter bombers. The landscape that once carried Panzer divisions like tides now betrayed them. The first technological shock for Das Reich was the realization that Allied aircraft did not need to search for them. They knew where the division was, structurally, systematically, relentlessly. Die deutschen Soldaten hatten lang beliebt, das Air-Attack war eine Materie von Chance oder Zufall, ein enemy aircraft appearing am wrong place am wrong time. But in 1944, der Sky war nicht geprägt von Chance. Es war geprägt von Netzwerken. Reconnaissance planes, invisibel an hoher Altitude, fotografierten road junctions hourly. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park interceptete German transmissions und mapped movements in real time. French resistance fighters, hidden in farmhouses and forests, relayed convoy positions over radios die Germans could not detect. British analysts in England und amerikanische analysts in North Africa koordinierten strikes hour by hour, feeding targets to squadrons already circling over France. Die Germans still imagined einen Zweiten Weltkrieg fort wie der erste, Frontlines, Maps und Marching Arrows. Die Allies waren einen Krieg von Signalen, Data und Predictive Intelligence. Eine Rot, der appeared empty und safe at dawn, could, by noon, eine pre-plotted kill zone. The fighter bombers themselves embodied a technological leap the Germans could not match. For years, the Wehrmacht had trained with the expectation that aircraft were vulnerable during low-altitude attack runs. But the Allied planes used rugged airframes and powerful engines designed specifically for this hellish mission. The P-47 Thunderbolt could dive almost vertically, release rockets with terrifying accuracy, and absorb ground fire that would have annihilated lighter German fighters. The Typhoon, with its monstrous engine and broad wings, could carry rockets capable of cracking open the armor of German half-tracks and trucks with surgical brutality. German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive whistle of rockets more than artillery shells. A shell might be inaccurate, might miss, might overshoot. A rocket fired from a Typhoon felt personal. It felt inevitable. The Germans, desperately trying to adapt, turned to camouflage nets, but Allied pilots had already adjusted. They struck road junctions, forest clearings, and any location where a division might attempt to regroup or disperse. They were not hunting individual vehicles. They were hunting the very idea of movement. For Das Reich, that distinction became lethal. Each time the division attempted to disperse to avoid detection, it sacrificed cohesion. Each time it attempted to concentrate to regain momentum, it became a banquet set out beneath the sky. There was no balance, no solution, no doctrine that could navigate this contradiction. The Allied air presence turned every option into a trap. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, was a ghost. Its few remaining fighters flew sporadically, outnumbered, outclassed, and outfueled. They rose into the sky like martyrs, only to be swarmed by Allied fighters that patrolled in layers. High-altitude cover, mid-altitude escorts, and low-altitude attackers. Deutsche Soldaten prägten für ihre eigenen Air Support, nicht weil sie erwarteten Salvung, sondern weil sie die Nötigkeit hatten, zu glauben, sie haben nicht komplett allein gelassen von dem Himmel. Wenn No Help erreichte, der psychologische Ruptur war profound. Eine Wehrmacht ohne die Luftwaffe fühlte nackt, exposed und hunted. Technologische Asymmetrie extendierte Beyond Aircraft. Alliierte Navigationstools, Radiobeacons und Ground Control Stations erlaubten Piloten zu koordinieren Attacken mit Freitinning-Präzision. Mitweilen die Deutschen relieten auf Runners, Damaged Telephone Lines und Radionetzwerke kompromittiert von Allied Interception. Für das Reich, even Kommunikation bekam Gefahr. Eine Radiotransmission, intended to summon support or coordinate movement, riskierte Revealing der Location zu Allied Analysts, die Fighterbomber wenen Hours entsenden konnten. Silence bekam die einzige Verteidigung, but silence also meant Paralyse. Die divisionslogistische Probleme compounded die Devastation. Trucks were never meant for the attritional hell of creeping movement. Their engines overheated under constant idling. Their gearboxes cracked from stop and start strain. Tires shredded on debris-strewn roads. And every mechanical failure risked becoming an immovable carcass, a beacon for Allied aircraft. A single broken truck could doom an entire stretch of road, trapping vehicles in a column that the Allies would strike again and again like a hammer pounding an anvil. The Germans attempted to tow disabled vehicles aside, but towing required time, visibility, and exposure. Many simply abandoned them. The roads became graveyards of metal, twisted chassis, burned wrecks, skeletal frames that warned new columns of the death awaiting them. The technology gap widened into a doctrinal abyss. German officers still dreamed of counterattacks, of combined arms thrusts, of armored punches that would restore initiative. But the battlefield structure of 1944 no longer tolerated such dreams. A counterattack demanded movement. Movement demanded roads. Roads demanded daylight navigation. Daylight navigation demanded safety from the sky, and the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. German generals did not lose the ability to maneuver. They lost the right to maneuver. They had entered a war in which doctrine, no matter how refined, was irrelevant without the air umbrella that sustained it. The soldiers of Das Reich felt this loss not in grand strategic terms, but in every frightening second they spent under open skies. For them, the war had transformed into a ritual of fear. The pause before starting an engine, the sprint for cover when a shadow passed overhead, the tightening of the chest when the distant drone of aircraft grew louder. The sky was no longer an element of nature. It was a battlefield dimension owned entirely by the enemy, a space where German presence meant German death. The psychological collapse grew deeper with each day of the march. Men prayed for rain, for fog, for anything that would obscure their tormentors. A cloudy day felt like divine intervention. A clear morning felt like a death sentence. When Das Reich finally reached the periphery of Normandy, it was not a division arriving. It was a ghost force limping out of an air-constructed labyrinth. The soldiers were exhausted, their nerves frayed, their confidence hollowed out. The division had lost nearly a third of its vehicles, but the greater loss was something harder to measure: belief. The belief that German mobility could outpace enemy response. The belief that training and willpower could overcome material disadvantage. The belief that the sky was neutral. The sky was not neutral. It had taken sides, and it had taken movement away from Germany forever. By the time Das Reich crawled into the outskirts of Normandy, the division was no longer thinking in terms of orders, objectives, or doctrine. The march, once envisioned as a heroic dash toward a decisive battle, had become an ordeal of fear, humiliation, and disillusionment. And in that 17-day crucible, something inside the German psyche cracked. This was not a breaking caused by enemy tanks or infantry, nor even by operational setbacks. It was the shattering of a worldview, the collapse of the belief that the German soldier, through discipline, courage, and training, could endure anything the enemy threw at him. For the first time, the men realized they were not simply outmaneuvered. They were outclassed, outseen, outflown, outdecided. The psychological damage did not come from defeat on the battlefield. It came from being denied the chance to fight at all. Soldiers who once believed they were instruments of destiny found themselves hiding like fugitives in hedgerows, waiting for aircraft to pass, hoping that their next step would not draw rockets from the sky. The humiliation was suffocating. Men who had faced the Red Army without flinching now trembled at the distant hum of engines. Officers who once lectured on the importance of initiative now froze at intersections, terrified that a wrong turn would send their column into a pre-sighted Allied kill zone. Even the SS ideology, rigid, fanatical, built on the myth of German invincibility, began to dissolve under the relentless pressure of Allied air supremacy. Every soldier of Das Reich had been raised on the idea that Germany possessed incomparable fighting spirit, that resolve could overcome any material shortfall. Yet here, spirit meant nothing. No amount of will could stop a rocket. No amount of discipline could move a column faster than an aircraft could intercept it. For the first time, they understood that courage itself had become irrelevant. You could be the bravest man in Europe, but if the sky belonged to the enemy, you were simply a target waiting to be burned. This realization seeped into every crevice of their morale. In the early days of the march, officers reprimanded soldiers for abandoning vehicles too quickly. By the midpoint, even officers were sprinting from trucks at the faintest sound of engines above. Pride, once the defining feature of the division, turned to shame. Men felt exposed, hunted, forced into behaviors they associated with cowardice, hiding, crawling, freezing in place, praying for cloud cover. They could not reconcile their self-image with their helpless reality. And this internal contradiction tore at their identity more brutally than any explosion. Stories of what awaited them in Normandy further deepened this psychological collapse. Rumors spread through the ranks, Allied tanks by the hundreds, artillery batteries firing non-stop, naval guns flattening towns, American and British infantry advancing with overwhelming support. But these threats, while terrifying, were not what broke Das Reich. What broke them was the knowledge that they would arrive already crippled, missing vehicles, missing fuel, missing cohesion, because the march itself had become a gauntlet designed to destroy them before they even reached the battlefield. Some soldiers confessed to comrades that they feared the journey more than the battle. Others admitted that they now understood something they had never dared think aloud. Germany had lost control of the war. Not tactically, not strategically, but existentially. They sensed that the Wehrmacht was no longer a living, breathing force capable of deciding outcomes. It had become a collection of isolated formations trying to survive long enough to matter. The men of Das Reich realized this with growing despair. The modern battlefield was no longer defined by infantry or armor. It was defined by air, and Germany no longer possessed any. The collapse of belief spread upward as well. Officers tried to explain away delays to their superiors, but found themselves grasping at excuses that felt pathetic even as they spoke them. Roads blocked, they reported. Heavy resistance. Enemy sabotage. But the truth always followed in the next lines. Constant air attacks. Impossible to move in daylight. Divisions suffering losses before reaching combat. These reports read like confessions of impotence. The same commanders who once boasted of lightning advances now documented their own paralysis with the tone of men admitting betrayal, not by the enemy, but by fate itself. And yet, the deepest psychological wound came not from the air attacks themselves, but from the comparison with earlier German triumphs. In 1940, the French countryside had been a stage for German speed, columns racing at breathtaking tempo, outflanking entire armies, collapsing nations in weeks. The same roads that had carried Guderian's armored spearheads were now littered with the burned husks of vehicles that never reached the front. The landscape had turned against them. Geography felt hostile. Roads felt cursed. Villages felt complicit. Even the sky felt mocking. To the men of Das Reich, it felt as if history itself had reversed. The division's veterans recognized this inversion with particular anguish. They had once fought battles in which mobility dictated outcome. Now, mobility dictated death. They had once believed the enemy reacted to them. Now, they reacted to the enemy. They had once felt chosen. Now, they felt doomed. This shift in psychological gravity produced bizarre and tragic behaviors. Some men began refusing to ride in vehicles at all, believing that walking offered better chances of survival. Others became obsessed with camouflage, covering themselves in branches and leaves even while resting. A few developed a fatalistic calm, muttering that whether they lived or died was no longer connected to anything they controlled. The sky had become the arbiter of fate, a godless, mechanical, indifferent god. Particularly devastating was the realization that no amount of tactical skill could compensate for the imbalance. German soldiers knew how to fight men. They did not know how to fight a force that struck from altitude, that chose the moment of battle unilaterally, that killed without risk, without warning, without even being seen. This asymmetry overturned the moral balance of war itself. It felt unfair in a way that transcended military logic. It felt like annihilation masquerading as strategy. And beneath all this fear lay a deeper, quieter emotion: betrayal. Not betrayal by commanders or by doctrine, but by the nation itself. Germany had promised its soldiers that sacrifice would be rewarded, that struggle would yield victory, that the Reich would arm them with the tools necessary to triumph. But the reality was stark. They had been sent into a mechanized war without control of the sky, without fuel, without intelligence, without hope. As the men trudged toward Normandy, they understood that no amount of heroism could change the fact that the nation had failed them. They were pawns in a game whose rules they no longer understood. Thus, by the time Das Reich reached the edge of Normandy on the 17th day, something in the German soul had collapsed. Not morale, not discipline, those could be enforced. It was the deeper structure of confidence, the belief that they lived in a universe where German skill and resolve had meaning. Now they lived in a universe ruled by air power, where skill meant survival at best, and resolve meant nothing at all. The very thing that had made them soldiers, belief in their agency, had been stripped away. And yet, the greatest tragedy was still to come. The realization that their 17-day ordeal had changed nothing. They had survived the march, but they had not escaped its lesson. They were entering a battle that had already been decided, not by tanks, not by men, but by the sky. When Das Reich finally reached the front lines of Normandy, it did not arrive as the armored fist German High Command had promised. It arrived as a shadow, a battered remnant of what had once been a symbol of mechanized power. The division's tanks were fewer, their trucks reduced to scorched frames, their half-tracks abandoned across the length of France like a trail of defeat. But the true loss was not measured in vehicles, it was measured in revelation. Those 17 days had shown Germany a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The war was over long before they reached Normandy, because the war belonged to whoever owned the sky. The March of Das Reich stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that World War II was no longer a conflict of maneuver, willpower, or tactical brilliance. It had evolved into a war of infrastructure, intelligence networks, and air power so overwhelming that it redefined the meaning of movement itself. The division had set out believing that speed was still possible, that distance could still be conquered, that the Wehrmacht could still dictate tempo. But those beliefs disintegrated under the weight of a new reality. The sky had become the supreme terrain of war, and Germany no longer existed within it. The lesson was bigger than the division and deeper than the Normandy campaign. It revealed the structural transformation of warfare that Germany had failed to anticipate. Air supremacy did not simply give the Allies an advantage. It granted them the ability to sculpt the battlefield, to shape enemy behavior, to paralyze movement, to collapse logistics, to annihilate morale before soldiers even saw a shot fired. It meant that every road, every bridge, every convoy route, every crossroads belonged to Allied command long before German units arrived. Geography had ceased to be neutral. It now answered to the air. Für deutschen Generäls der Kollaps von das Reichs Mobilität tor away die feinen Illusionen von strategischen Kontroll. Die hätten built die entire doctrine auf Tempo, auf rapider Konzentration, auf den satten Strike, auf der Philosophie, dass ein fast-moving force könnt outdenk, outmanövrieren und überwältigen any Opponent. Aber in Normandy, Speed war nur länger a Waffe, es war a Liability. Movement attracted destruction, Stillness offered nur temporäre Reprise. Die Rot selbst bekamen a Battlefield, das Deutschland weder unterstand noch commandet. A Division, das Wand symbolisiert Blitzkrieg, nur embodied Impossibility. The psychologische und symbolische weight of this failure echoed far beyond the soldiers who endured it. It shattered the myth that German discipline could overcome material disadvantage. It exposed the fragility of a military machine that had been built on assumptions of freedom of movement. It forced Germany to confront the fact that modern industrial warfare was not shaped by the bravery of men, but by the systems that supported them. Radio networks, reconnaissance grids, intercept stations, aircraft factories, fuel pipelines. These were the real engines of victory. What Das Reich endured did more than delay their arrival. It forecast the collapse of the entire Eastern and Western fronts. Every German reinforcement heading toward Normandy faced the same nightmare. Every armored division in transit became a target. Every supply column became a statistic waiting to be added to the tally of destroyed vehicles. It was as if the entire German army had been placed inside a slow-moving grinder, one operated not by infantry or artillery, but by air power that never slept and never relented. The Luftwaffe could not defend them. German logistics could not sustain them. German doctrine could not save them. And for the first time, German soldiers realized that they were participating not in a clash of armies, but in the final demonstration of Allied supremacy. The enemy did not need to defeat their divisions in battle. The enemy needed only to prevent them from arriving. And that is exactly what the Allied air forces did. In the decades after the war, military historians would study maps of Das Reich's march with disbelief. The division moved inch by inch through a landscape saturated with hostile aircraft and hostile civilians into a front already collapsing under naval gunfire, artillery saturation, and relentless Allied logistics. Some analysts would argue that the 17-day delay altered the course of the Battle of Normandy. Others would argue that nothing Das Reich could have done, no speed, no sacrifice, no miracle would have changed the outcome, because the war was already decided in the skies above them. This is the legacy of Das Reich's march, a demonstration that mechanized warfare had reached a new era. One in which armies could no longer rely on speed unless the air had granted them permission. A demonstration that mobility was no longer a question of engines and wheels, but of access to a domain Germany could no longer enter. A demonstration that even elite divisions, hardened by years of combat, could be reduced to helplessness if the enemy controlled the heavens. In the end, the most haunting truth is this. Das Reich did not lose a battle on the way to Normandy. It lost its identity. It lost its purpose. It lost its understanding of war. And in that loss, it revealed the fate awaiting the entire Wehrmacht. Not defeat in a grand clash of armies, but dissolution under the shadow of an enemy that ruled the dimension Germany failed to master. The sky closed over France in 1944, and as it closed the book on Germany's war.